All right. So welcome back to the Young Idealists. This is my channel and my series on classical German philosophy. And today I have a very special guest, a good friend and colleague and mentor of mine, Benjamin Norris, who has a PhD in philosophy from the New School for Social Research. And he's the author of Schelling and Spinoza, Realism, Idealism, and the Absolute from SUNY, which is a fantastic text. And it's recently just come out on paperback, so for a reasonable price, so that's fantastic. He's also published articles on the relationship between German idealism and contemporary continental philosophy, and he currently teaches at Rowan University. Ben is also one of the founding members of the Idealist Society of North America, a society that him and I are both part of, and he is currently the secretary of ISNA. And the reason why I asked Ben to speak today on Jacobi is because in his fantastic text, he has very good, well thought out chapters on the relationship between Jacobi's thought on both Spinoza and the problem of idealism and realism. And I thought that you would be a perfect candidate here to talk about Jacobi's philosophy and who he is and what he's all about. So welcome, Ben. Thank you for coming here today and joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris, for having me.
So part of this series is getting to know the thinker. So there's a historiographical aspect of it. So we go through the life of who Friedrich Henrich Jacobi is, and then we go through more of the main themes of his thought. So just before we, jump into who Jacobi is, I was wondering if maybe you could talk about maybe the significance and the importance of who Jacobi is and why he's important for us today.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the really interesting things about Jacobi, and this is true of a number of the influential figures in this period, is that he wasn't exactly a traditional academic, right? But he wrote some really important pieces on Kantianism and Spinozism that I think really framed in a sort of precise and concise sense the debate between system and freedom that was so important for thinkers like Hegel and Schelling to try to work through. And so basically philosophy, Jacobi wanted to argue, was fundamentally a systematic enterprise. And in being a systematic enterprise, it was a kind of totalizing enterprise through which the entirety of reality was supposed to be deduced from first principles. And for Jacobi, the sort of best example of this is Spinoza's Ethics. And as he saw it, these sort of systematic aspirations that philosophy had come into conflict with a lot of the sort of pre-philosophical and everyday understandings that we have about ourselves and our place in the world, particularly organized around the notion of final causes, right? So the problem of things like free will. And I just really think that this sort of plays a really central role in contemporary debates around the relationship between philosophy, theology, psychology, and some of the criticisms that come about idealist philosophy, kind of following, from the late Schelling and then into Schopenhauer and then definitely into Kierkegaard, right? So he's this kind of important sort of introductory figure for, I think, that whole trajectory. I think another really important thing about Jacobi is the way that he proposed that realism was the ultimate antidote to idealism, right? And he wanted to use this very idiosyncratic notion of faith in order to sort of criticize the scope of the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment's reliance on something like reason, right? Jacobi's going to say that, the Enlightenment wants to do away with a certain form of religious conviction, but it does so through placing a certain type of faith in rationality. So he's going to say that even though we're talking about reason here, there is this elaboration of faith that's necessary for understanding why we would be committed to reason as having the capabilities we give it. And then finally, and sort of most famously, even though it's been a little bit forgotten. Jacobi was the first person to popularize the term nihilism, right? So he uses this term in his letter to Fichte, and it's really, I think, the first systematic elaboration of the problem of nihilism. And one of the things that's really important to understand about it is that it wasn't just a sort of ethical problem. It was, for Jacobi, it entailed epistemological elements, ethical and moral elements, as well as ontological elements. And all three of those things kind of come together. But one of the things that you can see is there's a sense in which this accusation of nihilism is somewhat question begging, right? Because it assumes a sort of particularly Christian worldview and a Christian understanding of the relationship between creator and created. So when we're talking about nihilism, at least in this period, what we're really talking about is a sort of conflict between sort of classical traditional theological understandings of authority, and then these sort of newly developing philosophical sources and notions of authority. So I think that those are sort of the big three kind of themes that animate both Jacobi's work, animate his lasting influence, and that we can still see in a lot of contemporary philosophical debates. Even though his name doesn't necessarily come up in these debates, I think he's one of the people who, formulates this sort of most punctually.
Thank you for that very detailed answer. Yeah, part of this series is to kind of fill in the gaps. It's not just Kant and Hegel. There are other figures that are part of this wonderful debate. That is, Germany during this time, from the Enlightenment, the Romantic era. But you're the one that actually brought to my attention these series of writings by Jacobi, done by McGill and Queen's Press, which has a very good detailed biography by Giovanni, and also some of his main works as well. So it's really great text if you're interested in Jacobi's writings. But I was thinking, after that really nice introduction about how what the significance of his philosophy is, maybe you can take us through his life, his biography, maybe take us through the most significant parts of his life and how he came up with all of these wonderful ideas.
Yeah. So, and like you said, the Giovanni text has a really wonderful biography that situates him within his historical context, both politically, theologically, philosophically, all of these kind of things. But he was born in Dusseldorf in 1743, and his family were these sort of well-off merchants, right? So he was born into money. And there's this funny quote. As a child, he sort of is described as, quote, awkward and withdrawn, stubborn and highly strung, and given to brooding on religious matters such as the existence of God and the reality of an everlasting time, right? So, and I don't know how apocryphal this is, but this idea of brooding on religious matters and the problem of God really does animate a lot of the later writings that he's going to do. Because one of his entries into this problem has to do with the question of, well, if Descartes was able to prove the existence of God, right? What is the God that he proves, right? So his question is, what is the God of philosophy? What is this God that the philosophers have supposedly proven the existence of? So we can see how even from a very early age, this kind of problem, carries through the rest of his life. So he went for a brief apprenticeship at the age of 16, but then went to Geneva to be educated. And there he, like a lot of these folks around Kant's time, encountered the works of Rousseau. Right? Rousseau was very influential for these guys. He originally wanted to go to medical school, but his father sort of brought him back to help participate in the family business. So he does that for a little bit of time. He briefly works in government. I guess around this time, really the sort of scandalous detail that you find about his life is that he had an illegitimate child with his, quote, maidservant somewhat early on. He's married in 1764, and his wife actually dies 20 years later in 1784. which is actually a year after one of his sons had died as well. So this takes a very sort of big impact on Jacobi, and he never remarries. And one of the things that we'll talk about shortly is 1784 is sort of in the midst of the Spinozist controversy. Right? So there's really a lot going on in Jacobi's life during this period when he was arguably the most influential in terms of his public output. So eventually, right, he moves away from business, but he uses the wealth that he had accrued to set up a kind of salon sort of thing, right? And while he's there, he meets folks such as Goethe, Diderot, Hamann, Herder, and von Humboldt. So you can see that he begins, interacting with this rich intellectual scene at this time. One of the really important essays for Jacobi, and I think that this is a really interesting fact of his biography, is Kant's essay, The Only Possible Argument in Support of a Demonstration of the Existence of God. And one of the sort of central claims there is that when we're talking about possibility, that possibility presupposes necessity, right? So it presupposes the existence of a kind of necessary being. And Jacobi sees this as a articulation of a kind of Spinozism, right? And later, Omri Boehm is going to make a very similar argument in relationship to this essay. But it's just fascinating to see Jacobi already kind of putting his finger on this at the time. So again, sort of in this period, he discovers the work of Spinoza, in part due to his relationship with Goethe. Let's see, so the Spinozism controversy begins around 1785, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. But the one thing I'd want to note in the sort of historical recap is that, in 1785, Schelling was 10 and Hegel was 15. So we know that Schelling was a smart kid, but I don't think that he was reading the letters concerning Spinoza at the age of 10, right? So it's just really interesting to note the sort of lasting impact that this publication had on these sort of post-Kantian German idealists, right? It really continued to live on, despite the fact that they were just kids. I don't know if this is like folks of my age kind of rediscovering Nirvana at 15 after Kurt Cobain had been dead for a while, or what exactly it is. But I just think that's interesting to note. In 1787, he publishes a really important piece called David Hume on Faith, or Idealism and Realism. And it's in this essay where he kind of tries to defend his own usage of the notion of faith as a central part in supplementing philosophical rationality. So then he also publishes a couple novels, so these sort of philosophical novels. They're met with somewhat lukewarm reception, right? They're not quite literary enough. They're not philosophical enough. So, but as you pointed out, they are, or at least all will. One of them is. So then in 1799 is the publication of the letter to Fichte during the atheism dispute, right? Which I think was it 1798 to around 1801, I think. And I'm not going to go into the historical details of that too much, but that would be another fascinating episode in this series to really get through that. It was very hard for Fichte because Jacobi and Fichte were initially pretty close. Fichte thought that Jacobi would really get the science of knowledge. Like, he thought he would understand it and he thought he would enjoy it. And we kind of see, a little bit different of a response. From 1807 to 1812, Jacobi was the president of the Bavarian Academy of Science. And what's interesting about this is he, in part, took that position because he was kind of running out of money. So there was a financial necessity there. He needed to get involved in something. And so this is what he did. In 1811 is the publication of his critique of Schelling called On Divine Things and Their Revelation. And it has to do with, the problems of theology, naturalism, revelation, and pantheism in some of, Schelling's, what we might call the early middle works or something like that. In 1812, right, Schelling publishes his response to this book. And so this was actually, the last publication that Schelling would make during his lifetime, which is kind of interesting. And this exchange is what is, I guess, and was at the time, the actual pantheism controversy. So one of the things about when we look back on Jacobi, these three different controversies that he was involved in are sometimes collapsed into one. And we use the title, the pantheism controversy, to refer to everything from 1785 to this 1812 piece. But there's actually these sort of different stages that go on where there are different issues at play. And interestingly, when he publishes the piece in 1811, this is sort of where he begins to kind of break with Goethe, right? Goethe was like, no, Schelling is probably right about this. And so he retires in 1812. He begins working on his collected works. He writes an important preface to the David Hume dialogue, but then he dies in 1819 before he could see the completion of his collected works. So that's kind of his life narrative. It's not too scandalous or anything like that, but I think it provides, again, some helpful backdrop and some pretty helpful context for trying to piece through this puzzle of why did Jacobi have such a lasting impact on the development of post-continental or post-Kantian German idealism?
Yeah, I think you really did a really good job of highlighting the main themes and bringing out very good examples. The Nirvana example was hilarious. I agree with you on that. When you were talking about Spinoza and the young Schelling and Hegel, I kept thinking of this letter. It was a scandalous kind of letter. Schelling wrote this letter to Hegel where he's talking about expanding Kant's philosophy, but then he says, at the end of the letter, I'm a Spinozist. I have a new teacher. I'm a Spinozist, and it was almost like this is shocking. And so I think we have to realize how important Spinoza's role is during this time as this kind of figure that kind of undergirded the whole period of German idealism. And my two other guests that I had on this show, or on my series, I had Dustin Atlas, who talked about Mendelssohn, and then of course a friend of mine, Hannes Kerber, who talked about Lessing. And I didn't know much about Lessing. I didn't know much about. I know a little bit about the pantheism controversy because of texts by Weiser. But one of the interesting things, I didn't know the amount of stress that was put on this relationship, because at the time Lessing was sort of the last kind of voice of liberal thought in the Enlightenment. He was there for German values. He was there in a sense, waving the flag of tolerance, and his best friend at the time, Mendelssohn, who's Jewish as well, and was a great figure, lasting figure during the Haskalah and in Berlin. And they had this wonderful relationship of that only people can think of in a story at this time, Christian and Jew, and thinkers that work together and collaborate. And then here comes Jacobi writing this letter. No. He's a Spinozist, meaning, is this relationship, is it in turmoil now that Lessing's not a Christian? Maybe he's a Spinozist, and it causes such big problems. And Mendelssohn is left to defend his friend who has just passed away with his brilliant text Morning Hours. And he's kind of challenged that, okay, well, how do you see the role of Judaism and Christianity now? How do you see this coming out if Lessing's a pantheist? So a lot was at stake, and not just with Lessing, but this relationship that they have in regards to both philosophy and the liberal ideology they had that undergirded the state. So I was wondering, maybe we can talk about the pantheism controversy now.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and that's incredibly helpful, right? Because basically, the one-liner of the pantheism controversy is that Jacobi makes this scandalous proclamation that, a year before his death or something like that, Lessing in private confesses to Jacobi that he is a Spinozist. And so, like you said about the letter from Schelling to Hegel, Schelling is thrilled in this moment that he has become a Spinozist, right? Like he thinks that he has found the key for unlocking, his philosophical project. So why would it be so scandalous to say that this, very well-renowned and incredibly important figure in both German history and philosophy, why would it be such a big deal that he was a Spinozist? And sort of the story of the pantheism controversy, there's something really tragic to it, right? Because in a certain sense, it begins and ends with the death of these two friends whose friendships were, as you put it, right, essentially like this mythical kind of relationship that was supposed to represent, the possibility of what a German state could be, right? A tolerant and liberal state where Christians and Jews could have this kind of rich friendship. So the kind of breakdown at first is, right, Lessing dies on February 5th, 1781. So, and this is sort of where it all starts. So, as you were pointing out, Lessing was really influential in this time. Really now, when you are going to find Lessing quoted in these sort of works about, the sort of between Kant and Hegel period, we find Lessing's quote that Spinozism was treated like a dead dog in Germany, right? This is sort of, for whatever reason, his most famous one-liner, at least to, those of in the Anglophone world. So sort of the first question is, what does it mean for Spinoza to be a dead dog, right? And I think that people quote this line in a slightly deceptive fashion, not intentionally, but it kind of makes it seem like Jacobi was responsible for this resurgence in the interest of Spinozism in Germany. And that's really not the case, right? A lot of these folks were interested in Spinoza. There were a lot of people who were writing on Spinoza, thinking through Spinoza, right? His works were actually available in Germany very early on. So there was this sort of depth of knowledge and a tradition of interpreting Spinoza. And then the second question is, what exactly does it mean to be accused of being a Spinozist, right? In general, there's this idea that the problem is pantheism, right? Spinoza is a pantheist. He denies that there's any absolute separation between God and the world of created things, right? So if you accept that God and created things are one and the same, right, as he puts it, God or nature, then you deny the existence of this sort of traditional transcendent God who creates the world and either rules over it or, all of these kind of more traditional theological notions. And that was at issue, but also at issue were Spinoza's writings on politics and theology, right? So one of the major things for Spinoza is this idea where, he denies miracles, right? He says nothing is going to happen outside of the laws of nature. And he says that prophecy, right, is actually more dependent upon the imagination of the prophet. And then he's going to say that when we do biblical criticism and biblical research, what's really important is understanding the historical context in which these books of the Bible were written, right? So what he's doing there is, in a certain sense, he's denying that there is a directly revealed truth in the biblical texts themselves, right? The revelation of truth, if there is a revelation, is going to happen in history, and the Bible is sort of an approximation of trying to understand that, right? So it sort of removes some of the authority from the biblical text and places it back into that kind of everyday world in which everybody lives, right? So Spinoza, as controversial as his metaphysics were, his position on both politics and theology are really a threat to undermining what we consider as the sort of traditional sources of authority, right? The state and the church. So to be a Spinozist, in this sense, was to be kind of a radical, right? So, we have this great figure, Lessing, who, oh no, like secretly, right, maybe he is this sort of more radical guy. Okay, so basically then, to go into the pantheism controversy broadly, Following Lessing's death, right, Mendelssohn, who was very interested in the work of Spinoza and possibly even introduced Lessing to the work of Spinoza, he wanted to write basically a defense of Lessing's character, right? As you put it, they were very good friends, so he wants to defend his friend in the public eye. So basically then the breakdown of the controversy, and a lot of this happens in letters, so we have some very precise dates here, and I've taken some notes just to make sure I don't mess any of them up. But on March 25th, 1783, Elise Ramirez, who she acted as sort of an intermediary between Jacobi and Mendelssohn. For quite a while, they were corresponding with each other through her. It's only later when Mendelssohn actually directly writes Jacobi for the first time. So she writes to Jacobi, and basically Jacobi responds, and this is July 21st, 1783. And he asks her if she knew, sort of quote, in his last days, that Lessing was a committed Spinozist, right? So this confession was allegedly made in 1780 to Jacobi, right before Lessing's death. Then on August 4th, 1783, Ramirez tells Mendelssohn about Jacobi's letter, right? So you can see this sort of grapevine passing of this confession of Spinozism. And Mendelssohn hears this, and for a number of the reasons that you've already outlined, this would be a sort of scandalous proposition. So basically what happens then is Jacobi and Mendelssohn sort of resolve to take their debate public, and each plans to write a book. And on August 1st, 1784, Mendelssohn writes this to Jacobi, and this is sort of the direct writing that he puts in. I'll just quote it because it's wonderful. He says, "You have thrown down the gauntlet in chivalrous fashion. I will pick it up. And now let us fight out our metaphysical tournament in knightly custom under the eyes of our damsel, whom we both esteem." Right. So, and the damsel being Ramirez, so this is one of the things that I like to think about is what would have the pantheism controversy or the Spinozism controversy have looked like had it taken place on Twitter or something, right? So the chivalrous laying down of the gauntlet, I'm not really sure if that's what we're dealing with anymore. But again, you can see the sort of drama building up here. I think it might actually make for a kind of interesting movie. Not sure how interesting, but then basically what happens is Mendelssohn and Jacobi are both working on their books, right? In 1785, Jacobi's in pretty poor health. So he's been, and he writes back and forth about this. So he's been having a hard time finishing the book. And Mendelssohn is getting ready to publish his. So basically when Jacobi hears this, he sort of throws together this Spinoza book, right? Concerning the doctrine of Spinoza. And he is the one who's going to rush it off to the publisher. And it's published in September of 1785. And then the first part of Mendelssohn's book isn't published until October, right? So Beiser kind of describes this as sort of a race to the publishers, and Jacobi narrowly wins this race. So he gets his word out on Lessing first. And one of the reasons, there's sort of a subsidiary reason to why Mendelssohn was kind of shocked by Jacobi's book. And this is because it contained some private correspondences that Jacobi really didn't get permission to publish, because the Spinoza book is a collection of letters and then these kind of fictional dialogues that Jacobi sets up between himself and Lessing, and then later between himself and Spinoza. So it is this kind of hodgepodge book, but it includes some of these letters that Mendelssohn didn't necessarily think would be made public. And then so December 31st, and this is where we kind of come to the close of the historical aspect of this. So December 31st, 1785, Mendelssohn tries to rush the second part of his defense of Lessing's character to the publisher. This is the middle of the winter. He allegedly, right, he forgets his jacket. He gets a really bad cold on the way. And then he dies in January 4th, 1786. And apparently at the time, there was this kind of, open, rumor mill speculation and accusation that, Jacobi killed Mendelssohn in driving him to do this, right? So again, here we can see how we have, the very beginning, Lessing dies, and then at the end, Mendelssohn dies. And it's sort of this really odd end to this story of friendship. So, but yeah, that's basically the kind of historical breakdown. And when you're ready, I'd love to go through sort of some of the philosophical content of the Spinoza book.
Yeah, that's actually my next question. I was wondering if we can go through the content of that text.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, some of it is set up as a dialogue, right? So Jacobi is trying to recapture for the public the conversation that he had with Lessing, where Lessing confesses that he's a Spinozist. So basically, right, the provocation, and he's talking about his conversation with Ramirez in the letters, right? He says, when she came home again, I wrote to her and asked how much or how little Mendelssohn knew of Lessing's religious convictions. I said that Lessing had been a Spinozist, end quote. So that's the sort of line that kicks this off. And what you can see he's doing there is both talking about Spinoza in relationship to this very prominent figure who had just passed, but also insinuating that Mendelssohn didn't know Lessing as well as he should have, right? So you can see almost this kind of undermining of that sort of great friendship, right? So, and one of the things that's important about this opening line is that Lessing isn't described philosophically as a Spinozist, right? Jacobi's not saying that Lessing's philosophy is Spinozist. He's saying that his religiosity was Spinozist, right? And as we get to the end of the letter, we find that to be a Spinozist was essentially to be an atheist, right? So to be religiously Spinozist was tantamount not to having a religion at all. So, yeah, so then after going through a few of the letters, he begins this dialogue between himself and Lessing. And they give sort of the general characterization of how Spinoza is understood by Jacobi in this date, right? So he writes that there is no other philosophy than that of Spinoza, end quote. And this is sort of a major aspect of Jacobi's overall understanding of philosophy, is that philosophy is, as he's going to put it, of one piece. And the most consistent demonstration of a philosophy of one piece that comes from a single principle is Spinozism. So that's the kind of height to which any philosophy can reach. So any successful philosophy is essentially going to be Spinozism, which, as we're going to see, carries with it its own sort of intrinsic issues and problems. So then what is the fundamental principle from which Spinozism derives? Jacobi is going to say that it's, right, sort of a formulation of the principle of sufficient reason, right? From nothing, nothing can come. And so we want to kind of understand, if this is the backbone or the beating heart of all of Spinoza's philosophy, why is that such a problem, right? Because in general, we think about something like the principle of sufficient reason, right? The idea that for any effect, there's a cause for that effect, and the relationship between cause and effect is intelligible and explicable, and we come to know the world by way of tracing this relationship between causes and effects. You know, why is that such a big deal? It just seems like a basic element of the way we explain ourselves in the world. So if there's only nothing, then nothing can follow from that, right? So, and this is going to really come back up in the atheism dispute and the letter of nihilism, right? So basically then what this leads to, Jacobi's going to argue, is a denial of final causes, right? Because if we only have to explain things in relationship to their prior causes, we don't need to look to the end of that chain, right, in order to see what's happening. And for Jacobi, when you deny the existence of final causes, essentially what you're doing is denying the possibility of freedom or freedom of the will, right? And Spinoza is open about this. And then, so I think it's interesting, right? Jacobi's later going to expand on this. So in 1789, in the sort of supplements and expansions that he makes, he defines this sort of form of thinking based on efficient causes that eliminates final causes as mechanism. Right? So, and then here we get that sort of core critique of mechanistic, materialistic, atheistic philosophy. Yeah, good. So then the second claim, right, this idea of philosophy as one piece, leads into a conversation about the problem of the transition from the infinite to the finite, right? And this is something that you'll be very familiar with because of, your research on Schelling, right? This is a major question that he's trying to work through. And the reason why this question is so important comes back to that earlier problem of refusing a separation between creator and created. So if there's no possibility of transitioning from the infinite to the finite, right, then it says, basically the critique is that it reduces the infinite or reduces God to the sum total of finite existence or something like that, right? So when we do this, we eliminate the possibility of a transcendent creator of the world, which, as we're going to see for Jacobi, is a very, very important issue. So basically, then Jacobi's going to state explicitly the distinction he sees between himself and then the sort of Lessing Spinoza figure, right? So he writes, I believe in an intelligent personal cause of the world, to which the character in the dialogue Lessing responds, I note that you would like to have free will. For my part, I don't crave one. So I thought that this is a really interesting kind of line here, right? So it brings us to the point where we have to think about what role does desire play in philosophical exposition, right? Lessing is kind of saying to Jacobi, yeah, I mean, sure, you think that there are final causes, you want this personal intelligent creator, but that's because you have a desire for free will. I don't have that desire, so I'm going to explain things on different terms. Right. So when all of this is sort of connected with Lessing's earlier claim, right? It's Jacobi's claim, but Lessing is the one who voices it in the dialogue. The idea that Spinozism is the most complete system of philosophy that's born from a single principle. Then we have the conflict between system and freedom emerge, right? So these are the two constellations of issues from which this sort of debate that's then going to be taken up by Schelling and Hegel is kind of framed, right? So Lessing, the Spinozist, has no desire for free will and explanations in relation to final causes or something like that. Jacobi, on the other hand, right, desires this intelligent and personal creator of the world and a free will. So Jacobi is going to be more inclined to do away with the system in favor of freedom, whereas Lessing says, I don't really care about freedom. Let's just do the system. So this discussion then turns to Spinoza's claim, basically in the end of book 1 of the Ethics. And I thought I'd read this because there's sort of an extended discussion about, the almost phenomenologically unintuitive conclusion that Spinoza comes to, that we don't act out of sort of free will, right? So Spinoza writes, all the prejudices here I undertake to expose depend upon this one, that men commonly suppose that all natural things act as men do on account of an end. Indeed, they maintain as certain that God directs all things to some certain end. For they say that God has made all things for man, and that he might worship God. End quote. And then, because as Spinoza writes elsewhere, man is not a kingdom within a kingdom, right? That is a being that plays by a different set of rules. This means that if nature doesn't act according to final causes, and we are part of nature, then neither do we. Right. So, and they really take up discussion about, like, can we really explain what we do every day if we deny that we are doing things for a purpose, or we deny that we are doing things for a reason? And then, so basically, Jacobi's going to sort of come to a conclusion here. And he says, right, Lessing cannot accept the idea of a personal, absolutely infinite being, unfailingly enjoying his supreme perfection. He associated with an image of such infinite boredom with it that he was troubled and pained by it. So I really like this idea that Jacobi's trying to frame here of the eternal, immortal, personal, intelligent God as this kind of infinite boredom, right? This God does not struggle. This God does not overcome, right? What is a kind of life without those sort of things, right? This sort of ideal of divine perfection. And then, right, at the very end, we have Jacobi really sort of bullet pointing out his understanding of Spinozism. And this is when he simply says, right, Spinozism is atheism. So, I think from that you get a sort of broad picture of how Jacobi understands Spinoza and kind of what he wants to save against this Spinozist understanding of philosophy as a kind of derivation monism, right? Where you have your fundamental first principle, the principle of sufficient reason, and you lay out all the causes from that, right? All the consequences from that principle, and then we're done with it, right? We've created the system of philosophy. And as you know, right, this attack on Spinoza applies to a solid number of the post-Kantians who wanted to work in Kant's wake, right? Not necessarily the critics of Kant, but those who wanted to complete the Kantian project. They thought that that first principle was lacking. So Jacobi's critique of Spinoza here can equally be applied to that sort of philosophical effort that, went on and on and on and on. So I think that those are sort of the primary strokes of the Spinoza controversy. And you can see there, again, the themes that were taken up by later philosophers as they were framed by Jacobi, right? So even in Schelling's letters on criticism and dogmatism, he approvingly cites Jacobi's characterization of Spinoza, right? He says Jacobi was right when he says that Spinozism, the fundamental principle, is this articulation of the principle of sufficient reason. So this sort of text and this presentation of Spinoza continues to linger on.
Yeah, and there was a lot of weight added to this critique because as Dr. Atlas was, as Dustin was saying, the authorities, get a hold of Mendelssohn and say, okay, well, listen, if Lessing was a Spinozist and an atheist, and all of these ideas, these liberal ideas of tolerance are there, is it really atheist? Is it an atheist principle that allows, the tolerance of other ethical, ethnic beings? And I really like Dustin's answer. He says, no. This is a false understanding of Lessing, and a false understanding of his understanding of revelation.
Right.
We can think of a house. He says, Judaism is the foundation. It's the first floor. Christianity is the second floor, and you couldn't have the second floor without the first floor. I really like that example. Right. But one thing that you brought up. Oh, sorry, you were about to.
Oh no, I was just going to say really quickly, like one of the things that your comment brings to the fore is, in a certain sense, what was at stake was not really whether or not Lessing was a Spinozist, right? Jacobi kind of uses this as an occasion for presenting his critique of Spinozism generally, but the stakes were much broader, right? It really had this political significance of, right, to what degree and how is the Enlightenment consistent with these traditional sources of authority, right? Namely, scripture, church, and state. So exactly, so when Jacobi is trying to defend his own position against Lessing's alleged Spinozism, what he's doing is trying to preserve some traditional form of society, right? He had very serious fears of the Enlightenment project, not as a philosophical project, but as a social and political project. So that really, I think, again, highlights, or at least makes clearer, the lasting impact of this controversy, right? Because if it really was just about if Lessing was or was not a Spinozist, it's not clear that it would have had the sort of longevity, right, and the impact that it did. But because it was about so much more than just that, and this is why talking about it is hard, because you want to get into the dates and the details because, they're interesting and all of that. But if you don't kind of zoom out and see some of the broader context, it can be a little bit hard to understand why this book that's, Jacobi's a great writer, but it's not a great, a wonderfully constructed piece or anything like that. But it has this lasting impact, which is, I think, in part due to a lot of what you were bringing up. Yeah.
And
but yeah, sorry, I interrupted.
No, that's great. And it also rolls over into another big big, great debate over Fichte and Fichte's philosophy of whether Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre has this principle, or whether it has God within the system. And of course, Schelling at the time, in the 1801, is defending, in the 1800s, he's still in Jena, he's defending Fichte, who's been, they say he was dismissed, but I think Goethe came to him and said, listen, you should step down and get away for a while, and then we'll figure out what's going on. But Schelling was under attack because he was standing up for Fichte. He was, and right until 1804, he was still, he was still under the gun from this dispute. So I was wondering, now that we brought up Fichte, if we could talk about his Jacobi's letters to Fichte, and maybe we can, after that, we could jump into the whole Schelling and Fichte, and maybe we can both discuss the implications of system and freedom, or if you like.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so this is sort of the second large-scale controversy that Jacobi was involved in. During the atheism dispute, a lot of people wrote kind of open letters, either in defense of Fichte or criticizing Fichte. Like I said, it's a very sort of complex thing, and I think it would be really great if you were able to do an episode on it. I know there's a collection, I believe. There's a collection on it, so it might be really great to do that. I just note really quickly, as you know, the relationship between Fichte and Schelling sours at some point. And in this text, right, one of Schelling's many wonderful, incredibly long titled essays, right, a statement on the true relationship of the philosophy of nature to the revised Fichtean doctrine. Schelling actually summarizes, or more or less takes up, some of the language in Jacobi's open letter. And I've always wondered if that was kind of an underhanded attack on his former friend in relationship to this open letter that I want to talk about a little bit. So basically, the reason why I wanted to do the Spinoza book in relationship to the open letter is that one of the things that you can see in the Spinoza book is that the problem of nihilism as such isn't really in there, right? So when we try to understand the broad pantheism controversy as circulating around nihilism, I think we lose some of the sort of significant differences that Jacobi comes to see between Spinozism and then transcendental idealism. So one of the things that's really interesting about the letter is that it's not necessarily just some kind of like cold-blooded attack. There's a sense in which Jacobi wants to defend some of Fichte, right? Like, he actually has a lot of esteem and admiration for what Fichte was able to accomplish philosophically, right? But what he wants to get at, and this kind of comes back to the end of our earlier conversation, is the consequences that this sort of completed system of philosophical idealism has, right? And particularly to a kind of traditional understanding of the world. Good. So basically, yeah, the overall debate concerns the consequences of a complete system of transcendental idealism, right? So if the derivation of a system from a single first principle, if it's successful, what follows from the success? And one of the things that Jacobi's going to put at the very beginning of the essay is the problem of transcendence, right? A lot of what's going on here has to do with this conflict between immanence and transcendence, or in this case, what we could call, Frank's right, a derivation monism versus sort of more traditional theological understanding of transcendence. So at the opening of the letter, Jacobi writes, "For since I regard the consciousness of non-knowing as what is highest in man, and the place of this consciousness as the place of the true that is inaccessible to science, so I am bound to be pleased with Kant that he preferred to sin against the system rather against the majesty of that place," right? So what he's referring to here is the kind of incompleteness in the Kantian system, right? The idea of limiting reason in order to make room for faith. And Jacobi is going to say, this is, right, I'm on board with that. That's great. the problem with these post-Kantians is that they want to close that gap, right? They want to complete that system. So then he sides with Kant because of the sort of quote unquote failure, right? What comes to be characterized as the failure of the Kantian system. And then, so there's a really important difference here between the open letter and the Spinoza book. And I think it's really punctually framed in the following quote. So he's speaking of transcendental idealism, right? Fichte in particular. And he says, one has accused his philosophy of atheism quite unjustly, right? So here he's defending Fichte. Fichte is not an atheist. But, right, the caveat is because transcendental philosophy cannot, as such, be atheist any more than geometry or arithmetic. But for that same reason, it cannot be theist either, right? So he's saying that these pieces, right, arithmetic, geometry, transcendental idealism, the problem of theism or atheism doesn't even arise, right? And Jacobi's conclusions are not going to be, strictly speaking, philosophical for why that's an issue. But basically he's going to say to accuse philosophy of atheism, right, you're kind of missing the point, or at least transcendental idealism, because you'll remember earlier he was quite explicit that Spinozism is atheism. So we can see a really important demarcation there. And because the terms theism and atheism aren't applicable to transcendental idealism, I think this is the major reason why he introduces the term nihilism, right? He needs a new kind of word or a new concept to explain the shortcomings of this new philosophical project, right? So that's, I think, really the core of the important difference between these two controversies. So basically, then he's going to go on and he talks about God and knowledge, right? So he says, a God who can be known would be no God at all. So we can see here Jacobi emphasizing the importance of the existence of something outside of this sort of relational system of knowledge, right? Because, and this kind of connects to what I think of as the three prongs or the three aspects of the accusation of nihilism, right? And one is epistemological, which we've already begun touching on. Then there's the ethical, and in my view, right, both of these are based upon an ontological issue. So basically what he's going to say is, yeah, one second, let me find the quote.
Take your time, take your time.
Good, right, so here it is. He's going to say, I understand by the true something which is prior to and outside knowledge, that which first gives a value to knowledge and to the faculty of knowledge to reason, right? So there has to be something prior to and outside of knowledge in relationship to, right, in order for knowledge to be true in a significant sense. And he responds, right, my solution to, therefore, is that my reason is not the I, but the more than I, the better than I, something entirely other. So here you can see the critique of Fichte, right? And this first principle of the Wissenschaft. So then he sort of expands this, right, to also talk about ethics, right? So he's going to say, but what is the good? But the good, what is that? I have no answer if there is no God, right? So again, just as truth needs something to be outside of truth in order to be true, there needs to be something outside of goodness, right? The sort of goodness beyond goodness in order for us to be able to have these sort of moral and ethical connections. I guess just really quickly before getting into the ontological aspect, I want to connect this back to the problem of the principle of sufficient reason as articulated in the Spinoza book, because he expands on this and he does so in some just really beautiful and dramatic lines. So I just want to frame it and then read a couple of these quotes. So, right, there's this idea that from nothing, nothing can come, right? And he's argued that, right, as these quotes on morality and epistemology in relationship to the science of knowledge show, for Fichte, according to Jacobi, there is nothing outside of that system, right? So if there's nothing outside of that system, then nothing can come from the outside, right? So then he's going to write, I highlighted this as the core passage, but now I can't find it. Here it is. Okay, so I love this. This is one of my favorite quotes, right? So he says, "This is not how it is. And for this reason, man loses himself as soon as he resists finding himself in God as his creator, in a way inconceivable to his reason. As soon as he wants to ground himself in himself alone, then everything gradually dissolves for him into his own nothingness. Man has this choice, however, and this alone, nothingness or a God. If he chooses nothingness, he makes himself into a God. That is, he makes a phantom into God, for it is impossible, if there is no God, that man and all that surrounds him should be anything but a phantom. I repeat, God is and is outside of me, a living and self-subsisting being, or I am God. There is no third, right? So again, you can see this idea that without that kind of externality, without that transcendence of the intelligent and personal creator, then everything inside slowly turns into a phantom, right? Everything inside slowly turns into nothingness. And this is where we get to that principle of nihilism, right? So because transcendental philosophy is, according to Jacobi, indifferent to the problems of theism and atheism, then it's going to dissolve into nihilism, right? Where everything becomes nothing. And then just to really quickly conclude, this is why I think we have these ontological conclusions that ground both the epistemological and the moral problems of nihilism, right? If there is nothing outside, right? If nothing exists outside of this system of philosophy, then that system of philosophy is basically a self-replicating nothingness, right? Nothing significant can come from nothing. There's only nothing outside of philosophy, and therefore, right, everything within the system slowly turns into these shadows and these phantoms, right? I've described this elsewhere as the sort of nightmare of philosophy, right? From which philosophy is unable to wake if it denies these sort of theological notions of a transcendent creator, right? So yeah, I think that those are kind of the broad contours of what goes on in that letter to Fichte, and I hope it's clear. I hope I was able to make clear why it's different than what goes on in the Spinoza book. It's based on some of the conclusions in the Spinoza book, and it also draws from some of the conclusions in the David Hume essay. But I think it actually marks a sort of development in Jacobi's criticism of idealism in particular, right? And then again, when we look back at the David Hume essay, how do we fix this, right? How do we get out of nihilism or something like that? And Jacobi is going to talk about faith, right? He's going to say there are some things in which we can be certain, and there are some things we can be uncertain in. We have to have faith in some of those uncertain things. So sometimes this is understood as a sort of irrationalism, right? That he's rejecting reason or something along those lines. But I don't think that that's necessarily true, right? Because what he wants to talk about then is realism, right? He says that in a certain sense, if we're going to avoid nihilism, we have to be realists. And his realism is this sort of specific form of realism that has to do with the immediacy of the everyday world that we're able to experience if we, let's say, loosen the grip that reason has on us and just have faith in this, right? Faith in the sort of experience of the everyday.
Can I throw you on the spot and ask you, what do you think Jacobi's definitions of idealism and realism are? Just to clear, I mean, because I think you do a fantastic presentation. You did a fantastic presentation, but just for the viewers, what would Jacobi consider idealism, and how does that differ from his realism?
Yeah, that's great. So one of the things about looking at some of these texts in this period, as you know, is that they're not strictly speaking consistent with our, the various contemporary vicissitudes of all the different forms of realism and idealism that have sort of cropped up outwards. But so I think that for Jacobi, one of the sort of core principles of idealism connects back again to this definition of philosophy as a sort of project of derivation from first principles, right? So one of the things that he talks
Yeah, so I apologize. My internet was a little unstable there for a second. So I was wondering if you could maybe hash out what Jacobi's understanding of idealism is, and from there how he sees realism.
Mhm.
You know, because you do a really great presentation. You've done a really great presentation of who he is, what his philosophy is, and it would be really nice, I think, for the viewers to see the differences.
Yeah. So it's a little bit difficult because I think that when we try to use our sort of contemporary terms, specifically in terms of realism, right, there are a lot of sort of different forms and articulations of realism that have kind of come out, right? Jacobi is obviously not a scientific realist, a critical realist, these kind of things. I think that he's closest to the kind of realism that gets articulated in some of these newer phenomenological projects, right? This idea that there is a reality to our immediate experience of givenness, right? And when we allow reason to sort of interfere with that immediacy, we're drawn out of that everyday world, right? So this is why Jacobi is going to talk about how we need to take a leap of faith out of philosophy and back into that everyday world of immediacy. So I think realism for him has to do a lot with that. That's how the individual would become a realist. And then in a broader sense, right, he is a realist where realism relies on a notion of transcendence, right? God must be real, outside of me, above me, right? These kind of things. Because if God is not real and nothing can come from nothing, then everything else becomes nothing, right? So there's that kind of thing. And then in terms of his understanding of idealism, I think the way I understand this at least has to do with his comment about how he was able to understand the science of knowledge in the first place, right? He says, my entry point into that system was through Spinoza. And he says, I came to recognize Fichte as a kind of inverted Spinozism, right? So idealism then is this kind of self-enclosed system of rational determination and exposition, right? And so when the I becomes the first principle of philosophy, then it becomes sort of idealist in this problematic sense. Another way he puts this in the David Hume dialogue is he basically says that idealism is a form of madness, right? Because the idealist takes their words and their thoughts to be actual things, right? He says that the idealist confuses representations with reality, right? And when they do that, right, they're indistinguishable from, the madman, the lunatic, the sleepwalker, the daydreamer, these kind of things. So, idealism for him is defined in part as that kind of, as McDowell might call it, this frictionless spinning in the void, right? So that's kind of the broad parameters of that.
That was great. That you hashed it out perfectly. I think just if you're okay with this, because I don't want to take too much of your time, if you're all right, maybe we can end off with the whole Schelling and Jacobi um, problem, which then gets up with pantheism again, if you don't mind, and then we can call it a day because I don't want to take you too long.
Yeah. So again, Jacobi in general did not have. It's not that he didn't have a high opinion of philosophy, but he basically thought that every philosophy was going to run into the same problem, right? He thought that there was a fundamental conflict between sort of pantheism, naturalized pantheism, and this kind of traditional form of theism that he wants to defend, right? So even in the Freedom Essay, right, which Schelling believes himself to be developing upon that 1804 philosophy and religion text, right? So there's a sense in which he's beginning to move away from some of his nature philosophical speculations, right? But at the same point in time, there is a sort of continuity there, right? I'm sure you're familiar with Sean's recent book on the philosophical foundations of the late Schelling, right? So at this point, Sean says that, we go from Schelling 1 to Schelling 2. Schelling 1 is a philosopher of nature. Schelling 2 is a philosopher of revelation. But it's not that Schelling 2 sort of cancels out Schelling 1, right? The Schelling is a philosopher of revelation, is still a philosopher of nature, but right, in a sort of different sense or different perspective. And, it seems like Jacobi is just going to deny that this is possible, right? And this sort of puts together a very, let's say, conflicted relationship between the two. I guess I'll just read a quote that's from one of Schelling's letters. And this is from, I believe, before he had actually read Jacobi's book. But, Schelling says of Jacobi, "This man who knows how to deceive the world so well has an amazing arrogance joined with such an absence of compassion and courage that it takes 6 years' observation to really appreciate. No doubt the world will once more be preached the reprobate doctrine of know-nothing," right, which is what I was trying to describe in the letter to Fichte, "with pious condemnations of the godlessness of our pantheism and atheism. I hope he will be attacked on many fronts." And then I think this is the line that's really, really fascinating. "The damage that he has caused and continued to cause is unbelievable." So again, like I was saying, originally there's this, Schelling approvingly cites from Jacobi's work. And then, right, there's this kind of debate and dispute between the two of them. In Schelling's response, he's basically going to say, one, like, well, yeah, Jacobi, of course you're calling me an atheist and a pantheist. That's what you call everyone. Like, that's just what you think philosophy is. But he's also going to try to show how there is a kind of compatibility between revelation and a certain form of naturalism, right? So if folks are really interested in getting into that, Sean McGraw's Philosophical Foundation of the Late Schelling discusses this in detail, and Dale Snow's wonderful book on Schelling also discusses this debate. But one of the things in this context that I wanted to throw back to you, because I know that you've been working for a while on Schelling's positive philosophy. And one of the things when I look at this sort of Jacobi-Schelling relationship, right, in the early Schelling, I think it's really easy to see what he's picking up on from Jacobi, right? This question of system and freedom, the characterization of Spinozism, some of these themes, right? And then there's this moment in the middle, right? This pantheism controversy, which is pretty truncated, right? Unlike the Spinozism controversy, this one, it was pretty short, right? 1811 to 1812. They published these books right after one another. Once we get to the positive philosophy, in the lectures on the history of modern philosophy, Schelling seems to be warming up to Jacobi a little bit again, right? His discussion of Jacobi in there is pretty approving. You also see that in Hegel, right? Hegel actually, thought that there's a lot of value in Jacobi's theories. But by the time we get to the positive philosophy, I feel like Schelling really tries to, if we're going to characterize it as attempting to solve the problem of nihilism, which in part it is, right? Then his solution is strikingly similar to that of Jacobi, right? Jacobi's characterization of philosophy as of one piece, deriving from a principle and thinking about reason's relationship to itself, right? This is what Schelling characterizes as negative philosophy. And then to supplement that, in a certain sense, we are, he says, in need of a positive philosophy, a philosophy of what? A philosophy of life, a philosophy of experience, and a philosophy of love, right? This is something that's developed from the freedom essay through the positive philosophy. And I think that, right, had Jacobi lived to hear those lectures, right, unlike Engels and all of these people who hated them, I think Jacobi would have been in the front row cheering him on, right? Like, yes, you got there, you see it. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yes, so for my viewers that don't know this, our third ISNA event, which was a summer series, we had Ben come and speak on the madness of idealism, Jacobi and realism. And you were talking about the Salto, and you were talking about faith, and you brought this question up, and you said that you see connections between Jacobi's philosophy or Jacobi's ideas and the positive philosophy. And this is something that I've been thinking about since that event. And it's interesting because, at the end of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant says, if you go past reason, if you go beyond reason, what you're left with is an abyss. You're left with this abyss. And it's funny because the beginning of the positive philosophy, especially the Paulus-Nachschrift, the philosophy of revelation, Schelling works up to a point where he says that, look, it's not reason that comes first, but it's being. Being precedes reason, and that we're kind of thrown into this middle. And he starts talking about a kind of, I always like to think of this as like a Meillet argument, the necessity for contingency, that contingency comes first because we're here in the moment, we're here with facticity. And he's kind of got a metaphysical realism now in the positive philosophy. So I do see similarities between that, especially with the difference between what he says is the prius, which has to do with the potencies in thought, and then the absolute prius, which is the fact. We're talking about revelation in the world. And there's a very distinct separation between thought and being comes first before thought. It's funny too, because you're so right about this. Now that I'm thinking about this, in the Grundlegung, like the grounding lectures on positive philosophy, what's the first thing that Schelling says? Schelling says, this is the only question that we should be thinking about is, why is there a something rather than a nothing? So that's so interesting that's a shout out right back to Jacobi, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so one of the other interesting things is, I think that, so one of the things that you can see very obviously lacking from Jacobi's discussion and characterization of nihilism is that he doesn't draw, or at least place it in a kind of historical narrative in the same way that thinkers like Nietzsche and Heidegger are going to do, right? They're going to say that in order to understand nihilism, we have to understand the history of our values, right? We have to understand the history of the determination of being, right? Whatever it is. And I think that maybe one of Schelling's kind of actions as a hinge in this discussion is, as you know, at stake in the positive philosophy and the philosophy of revelation is the reality of history, right? And the role that revelation plays in relationship to history, and the role that the history of revelation plays in relationship to our philosophical self-understandings. So it'd be kind of interesting to think a little bit more about how that kind of intervention allows us to begin constructing this historical narrative around these notions of nihilism. So, yeah, I hadn't really thought about that precise hinge before, so that's really interesting. Yeah, thank you, Chris.
Oh, you mean the prius and the absolute prius, that whole being and being preceding thought,
and particularly this notion that history is at stake in the turn to the positive, right? That is how we are going to, again, be able to articulate a robust notion of history, is through, right? He's going to say basically negative philosophy is not able to do this. And Jacobi would agree with him on that point.
yeah.
So that once we introduce this historical dimension, how would that, right, respond to or begin to fuller, like give more, put more meat on the bones of, what Jacobi is initially this sort of very kind of like sketched out theory of what nihilism is, but not necessarily like why nihilism, but just that problem.
In the chapter, I think it's in the third chapter of your book, you bring up this point that also Sean brings up, that the positive philosopher decides on the positive philosophy, realize that in a sense negative philosophy, this is a poorly equated idea of Hegel, but in a sense collapses the real and the ideal into this kind of absolute concept. And this is negative philosophy, where we're starting with the essence of things as opposed to the whatness of things, the thatness of things, not the whatness of things. Um, yeah, so this has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for coming here and discussing Jacobi and all of these and hashing out all of these ideas. What I think our viewers didn't know is that your master's thesis was actually on Jacobi and Fichte, correct? Am I sort of correct?
Yeah, so basically, yeah, the master's thesis really was where I kind of put together for the first time the systematic presentation of, right, the accusation of nihilism. Because, for example, in the Beiser text, he focuses on the epistemological and the moral elements. But like I said, I do think that there is that ontological problem underlying the entire sort of nexus of issues. And so what I tried to do in the thesis was then turn to Fichte's Foundations of Natural Right and talk about how the sort of embodied relationship that we have, right? There's this sort of proto theory of embodied recognition that takes place in the Foundations of Natural Right. And I wanted to argue that provided a response. But the defense, I was told that I basically framed Jacobi's accusation too strongly, and that the Fichtean response was simply not going to work for either Dick Bernstein or Omri. So, which is, I think, maybe in that moment was when I realized sort of how difficult it really is to move past some of these points that Jacobi makes, right? So, me personally, I was raised Jewish, I'm an atheist. And so I thought it would be easy to kind of do away with this, Jacobian problematic. But digging further and further into it, you can really see how there's just something about this entire way of thinking that he captures and frames so precisely that you will constantly see, if once you kind of get familiar with the ideas, that this problematic popping its head back up again. You say, oh, that's Jacobi. That's Jacobi again, right? And so he's just one of those fascinating figures. And I know that a lot of the figures in your series are like this, where we don't really study them very much anymore when we're looking at the history of philosophy or doing German idealism. But once you learn more about their ideas, you realize just this kind of continued legacy that they have. So yeah, thank you so much for having me on. And I've really loved the other episodes as well. So if folks are interested in a little bit more of the context here, they really should check out. Yeah, the piece on Lessing is incredible. The one on Mendelssohn is very, very good. So highly recommend. And thank you so much, Chris, for putting all of this together.
Well, thank you for being here. And you really hit that. You really hit a specific point here, that a lot of these thinkers, these marginalized figures within the history, are really so important to the entire kind of embodiment of German idealism. And that's why I have two series. I have a series on the Jewish thinkers of classical German philosophy, German idealism, and post-Kantian thought. And then I have these series as well. But as Manfred Frank says, the last great philosopher to be discovered is Maimon. Maimon is so important when it comes to post-Kantian philosophy. But yeah, thank you so much for being here. This was really, really great, and you really brought Jacobi to life, and really, really thankful for you being here.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that, Chris.
All right, well, take care and have a good day.
You too.